On May 23, 1934, an ambush with 197 shots took out Bonnie and Clyde in less than 20 seconds. But what came after is what nobody tells you. Crowds were ripping pieces of hair from the bodies. The car became a traveling circus attraction. An illegal dispute over all of it only ended in 2019. These are the 16 facts Hollywood would rather keep hidden. Fact 1. 167 shots in 15 seconds. The forensic report. On the morning of May 23, 1934, 6 lawmen were waiting for Bonnie and Clyde on a rural road in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. When the couple's Ford V8 showed up, the officers opened fire. In about 15 seconds, they fired around 167 shots. 15 seconds. You can count on your fingers how long it took to take down 2 of America's most wanted fugitives. The parish coroner recorded 50 wounds on Clyde Barrow's body and 23 on Bonnie Parker's. The car had 112 bullet marks on the body alone. Frank Hamer, the Texas Ranger who planned the whole operation, wrote in the official report that the scene was completely unacceptable to describe to the general public. And here's where it gets interesting. The government agreed with him. That report was locked away tight and stayed classified for 20 years, 2 whole decades before any regular person could read what happened on that road. When you have to hide a police report for that long, you start to wonder what else was in that document that the public wasn't allowed to know. Fact 2. The bodies stayed trapped in the car for over an hour. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow died before they even understood what was happening. But what came after was almost as disturbing as the ambush. No one went near the car for more than an hour. The officers thought other gang members might be hiding nearby. They waited, guns pointed, in a silence broken only by the Ford's engine still running. When they finally moved closer, they realized another problem. The bullets had warped the body of the car in a way that the doors simply wouldn't open. It took 2 men with tools to pry the doors off. And when they pulled Clyde out from behind the wheel, his foot was still on the accelerator. He died driving, literally. The car had 167 bullet holes. Later, the owner of the Ford, who had loaned out the vehicle without knowing, sued the government to try to get the car back. He got it, but the condition of what was left was hard to even look at. Fact 3. The crowd showed up within minutes before backup police. The shooting had barely ended, and the people of Sales, Louisiana, were already on their way. It was a rural area where everyone knew everyone, and the sound of the gunfire echoed far. In less than half an hour, more than 200 people surrounded the bullet-riddled car. And here's the detail nobody would expect today. There was no police tape. No one sealed off the area. The curious onlookers moved in and started touching the bodies. People were taking pieces of glass and metal from the car like they were fair souvenirs. One guy tried to cut off Clyde Barrow's ear and only stopped because Frank Hamer, the Texas Ranger who led the ambush, personally stepped in. Another man managed to cut a lock of Bonnie's hair without anyone stopping him. When police backup showed up 2 hours later, the scene was already complete chaos. Any evidence that could have been preserved was compromised. Today, any small-town sheriff would know to protect that area. But in 1934, the public's curiosity beat any procedure, and what was left was a crime scene destroyed before it could be investigated. Fact 4. Souvenirs from the crime scene were sold immediately. Less than a day after Bonnie and Clyde were killed in that ambush in Louisiana in 1934, locals were already looting the scene. Pieces of the bullet-riddled Ford V8, spent shell casings, shards of glass, even scraps of clothing ripped from the bodies. People grabbed whatever they could and started selling it. $1 to $5 a piece, right there on the side of the road. One local shopkeeper even placed a newspaper ad offering original relics from the Bonnie and Clyde shootout. Now pay attention to this part. Police later estimated that the amount of authentic souvenirs floating around out there was about 10 times more than everything that could have possibly existed at the scene. 10 times. People were making fake pieces and selling them as real, and buyers didn't even care. They wanted a piece of that story. That says a lot about the United States in the 1930s. Two outlaws who robbed banks and killed cops became overnight celebrities, and regular people lined up to own a bloody piece of that legend. Fact 5. The bodies were put on public display in Arcadia. After Bonnie and Clyde were killed on that Louisiana road, the bodies were taken to Conger Funeral Home in Arcadia, the closest town to the ambush. And that's when things got bizarre. The owner of the place, Charles Bailey, opened the doors to the public. Maybe it was out of respect for the curious crowds. Maybe it was a business opportunity. Probably both. The fact is, more than 2,000 people showed up that same day to see the bodies. 2,000. In a rural parish where almost nothing ever happened. The funeral home wasn't equipped to handle that many people. Police had to be called in to control the line that wrapped around blocks. And here comes the part that really hits. Parents brought their small children along, to see two bullet-riddled bodies, like it was some kind of lesson. It was treated like a circus attraction, and nobody there thought it was strange. That was the biggest crowd Bienville Parish had seen in decades. And the reason wasn't a county fair or a football game. It was the death of two of America's most wanted fugitives. Fact 6. The crowd tried to take pieces of the bodies as souvenirs. When Bonnie and Clyde's bodies arrived at the funeral home in Arcadia, no one expected what came next. Hundreds of people packed in, wanting to see the two up close. Up to that point, it was normal curiosity. The problem was that a lot of people wanted more than just to look. Local police reports documented that several people tried to rip out locks of hair, pieces of clothing, and even fingers from the corpses. One guy was arrested with a razor in his hand, trying to cut off Bonnie's finger to get her ring. He told the police with no shame at all that he just wanted a keepsake. Funeral director Charles Conger had to hire 2 men just to watch the bodies and keep the public from mutilating them. It was 1934, Louisiana, in a country that considered itself civilized. Bailey, one of the people involved in the case, told the Dallas Morning News that he had never seen people behave like that. To him, it was repulsive and impossible to look away from at the same time. America was broken by the Great Depression, and Bonnie and Clyde had become an obsession that went way past any limit of common sense. Fact 7. The Ford V8 became a traveling attraction. When police riddled that Ford V8 with bullets in May 1934, the car had an owner. Jesse Warren, a farmer from Louisiana, had had the sedan stolen weeks earlier by Bonnie and Clyde. After the ambush, police returned the car to Warren, full of holes, with more than 100 bullet marks. And here's where the story gets interesting. Warren looked at that destroyed car and didn't see a loss. He saw money. He signed a deal with a traveling show company for $150 a week. Good money during the Great Depression. The car became the star of fairs and exhibitions across the southern United States throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Whole families lined up and paid 25 cents just to see it up close and stick their fingers into the bullet holes. Think about that. The country was living through the worst crisis in its history, and people were pulling coins out of their pockets to see a car where 2 outlaws died. It says a lot about how Americans have always been fascinated by outlaw stories. The Ford survived all of that and is now on permanent display at a casino in Primm, Nevada, near the California state line. Fact 8. The car was stolen, recovered, and stolen again. When you have the most famous car in the American underworld, everybody wants to get their hands on it. And that's exactly what happened. Bonnie and Clyde's Ford V8 became a kind of traveling golden goose. Owners charged admission to show off the bullet-riddled car at fairs and parking lots across small-town America. The problem? Twice, someone simply drove off with it. The first time was in 1936 in Oklahoma City. They found the vehicle relatively quickly. The second time in 1940 was more complicated. The car disappeared for 6 months until it turned up abandoned in a barn in Mississippi. Think about the irony. The car that belonged to America's most famous thieves being stolen by ordinary thieves. Between 1934 and the 1960s, the Ford passed through the hands of at least 14 different owners. Each change of ownership came with its own story, almost always involving money, dispute, or opportunism. The full chain of owners is documented, and if you read that list carefully, you'll realize the story of the car after the ambush is almost as turbulent as the lives of the outlaws who drove it. Fact 9. The ambush guns were sold by Frank Hamer. When the dust settled on that Louisiana road, police recovered a full-on arsenal from Bonnie and Clyde's car, 13 firearms, rifles, pistols, a shotgun. By law, all of it belonged to the state of Texas. But the law and what actually happened were two very different things. Frank Hamer and the other 5 men in the ambush made a deal to take some of those guns home, like hunting trophies. Nobody questioned it much at the time. They had just killed the 2 most wanted criminals in the country. Who was going to say no? The problem is that decades later, those guns started showing up at collectors' auctions. And they weren't cheap auctions. We're talking pieces selling for anywhere from $100,000 to $500,000. In 2012, a .45 caliber pistol that belonged to Clyde Barrow went up for auction and sold for $240,000. Think about that. A police officer on a public salary kept weapons that, in the end, were worth a fortune. Nobody was prosecuted. Nobody gave anything back. What was a souvenir from the job turned into $1 million business, passed down from generation to generation. Fact 10. The families couldn't get all the belongings back. When news of the ambush spread, Bonnie and Clyde's relatives went to Arcadia, Louisiana, hoping to at least bring back the bodies and whatever was left of their belongings. But they got there too late. Most of the personal items had already disappeared. People from the area took whatever they wanted before any relatives showed up. The guitar Bonnie carried in the car was broken into pieces and handed out as souvenirs. Think about that. Pieces of a guitar became trophies. There was also $507 in cash inside the vehicle. That amount was never officially accounted for. Nobody knows who ended up with the money. The clothes the 2 were wearing were destroyed by the gunfire. Emma Parker, Bonnie's mother, ended up receiving only her daughter's body, and the clothes she was wearing when she died, soaked in blood. No other personal belongings were returned to the family. The Parkers tried to get the items back through legal means, but nothing came of it. It was 1934, and to a lot of people, those 2 didn't deserve respect even after death. The authorities treated the bodies like an attraction and the belongings like spoils of war. Fact 11. The local newspaper sold 10,000 extra copies in a town of 3,000 people. When Bonnie and Clyde were killed in an ambush on May 23, 1934, the news spread like wildfire. The Bienville Democrat, a small county newspaper in rural Louisiana, published a special edition the next day. The entire county had about 12,000 residents. The paper sold 10,000 copies. Think about that for a second. That was more than 3 times its normal circulation. Orders started coming in from across the South, then from New York, from people who had never even heard of that lost little county in the middle of nowhere. The print shop ran the same edition 3 times in 3 days and still couldn't keep up. The editor said decades later that the money from that single edition saved the newspaper from bankruptcy. The Great Depression was destroying businesses all over the country. Newspapers were closing every week, and there was a small town paper surviving because of 2 dead outlaws. That's the part nobody stops to think about. Bonnie and Clyde were already a profitable business before they were even buried. The tragedy became merchandise that very same day. The industry around them didn't start with the 1967 movie. It started right there, in that noisy print shop, running nonstop. Fact 12. Bonnie and Clyde's families found out about their deaths through the newspapers. Think about that. You're at home having coffee and find out your child died because the neighbor read it in the paper. That's exactly what happened to Emma Parker, Bonnie's mother. No one from the police knocked on her door. No one had that decency. Frank Hamer notified Dallas authorities as soon as the ambush ended on May 23, 1934, but the sheriffs were too busy giving interviews to the press. The Associated Press had already sent photos from the scene to newsrooms all over the country. The afternoon papers came out with everything plastered across the front page, while Emma Parker and Cumi Barrow, Clyde's mother, still hadn't received a single official visit. The news came first through the Dallas Morning News and other local papers. One of Emma's neighbors showed up with the newspaper in her hand, and that's how she found out. Cumi Barrow went through the same thing. Back then, selling newspapers mattered more than respecting a mother. The race to break the story ran right over any protocol. Today we complain about the media, but in 1934, it was already like that. Fact 13. Frank Hamer was criticized for not giving them a chance to surrender. When the gunfire stopped that morning in May 1934, Bonnie and Clyde were dead inside the car with more than 100 bullet holes. But the controversy was just getting started. Newspapers across the country questioned Frank Hamer and his 5 men for not giving the fugitives even 1 second to raise their hands. The New York World Telegram was blunt and called it an execution without a trial. Hamer didn't hide. He responded publicly with a logic that many Americans understood right away. Giving Clyde Barrow a chance to surrender would be giving him one more chance to kill police officers. And Barrow had already killed at least 9 lawmen by that point. What makes this story interesting is what came next. The debate lasted a few weeks and then simply disappeared. The country was deep in the Great Depression. Families were starving. Banks were failing. In that context, few people were willing to defend the rights of 2 criminals who had terrorized the central United States for 2 years. Public opinion chose Hamer's side, and the law took a back seat. Fact 14. The car was later tested to see if it was cursed. When the death car started traveling around fairs and exhibitions in the 1940s, the bad luck stories came along with it. People who touched the car felt sick. Mechanics who worked on it got hurt. It sounded like something out of a cheap horror movie. In 1953, a reporter from the Atlanta Constitution decided to seriously investigate it. He looked into every case and came up with 14 incidents since 1934. Accidents, illnesses, falls. He checked them one by one. And the verdict? They all had ordinary explanations, just normal bad luck in life. But here comes the good part. The journalist himself admitted the truth didn't really matter, because the stories sold like water in the desert. And he was right. The American public has always loved a good curse. Rabbit's foot, black cat, broken mirror. Bonnie and Clyde's car made that list with no effort at all. It became a kind of haunted attraction on wheels, and the tradition never died. The casino that displays the vehicle today makes a point of calling it cursed in its advertising materials. Nobody cares if the curse is real. What matters is that it sells tickets. It always has. Fact 15. The death spectacle that divided America. When Bonnie and Clyde were gunned down in May 1934, what happened to the bodies shocked even people who hated them. Thousands of people rushed to see the corpses. They ripped off pieces of clothing, locks of hair. Someone tried to cut off Clyde's finger as a souvenir. It was a circus, and Bonnie got the worst of it. Groups of Catholic women pushed back hard. The National Council of Catholic Women released a statement in July of that year calling it barbarism unworthy of a civilized nation. On the other side, conservative newspapers kept arguing that the two had lost the right to any respect because of the crimes they had committed. Here's what makes this interesting almost a century later. That fight was never settled. American society is still divided when a criminal dies violently. Do they deserve dignity? Do they deserve spectacle? In 1934, people shouted about it in newspapers. Today, they shout about it on social media. The question is the same, and no one has come up with an answer that satisfies everyone. Fact 16. The last lawsuit only ended in 2019. Bonnie and Clyde died in 1934, and the American legal system didn't stop dealing with them until 85 years later. In 2019, a federal court in Texas closed the last civil case tied to the ambush. The dispute was over the guns that were in the car on that day in May 1934. The question seems simple, but it wasn't. Who was the rightful owner of those guns after almost a century? The case had dragged on since the 1990s. The guns had passed through auctions, collectors, and museums over the decades. Every time they changed hands, the paperwork got more confusing. The court ruled that so many transfers had happened that it was impossible to determine a reliable chain of custody. Think about that for a second. Two Depression-era criminals killed on a Louisiana road were still creating legal battles in the iPhone era. The guns Frank Hamer and his men used or seized that morning kept circulating through the collector's market like they had a life of their own. And while lawyers fought in courtrooms, the bullet-riddled car remained on display in a casino in Nevada. The bodies stayed separated in Dallas cemeteries, and America still couldn't let go of this story.